For a long time, feminism was easier to explain than it is now. There was a period when the fight was brutally obvious. Women were locked out of political life, restricted in law, boxed into narrow social roles, and treated less like fully independent citizens and more like dependents whose lives were expected to orbit fathers, husbands, and family obligations. In that world, feminism had a simple shape. It was a push against clear barriers. It was about rights that were plainly denied, doors that were visibly shut, and public order that openly told women what they couldn't be. Over time, many of those formal barriers were challenged, weakened, or removed. That didn't end feminism, it changed it. What began as a movement centered on legal rights and public recognition became something broader, more layered, more internal, and a lot harder to define. That's where the real tension comes in. The history of feminism isn't just the story of a movement growing stronger, it's also the story of a movement becoming wider, more fragmented, and more argued over as the world around it changed. Early, organized feminism is commonly tied to the 1948 Seneca Falls Convention, while modern definitions have expanded well beyond that original rights-centered frame.
I was a girl with dreams so wide, eyes full of wonder, heart open, untied. The world seemed soft, a place to lay. Ran through the days in the sun's warm sway. But somewhere along the road I felt the shift. The days turned heavy like an unseen rift. The girl that I was began to fade, and in her place a new self was made. I'm in between, I'm not quite all a girl, a woman, both in my soul. Learning to balance, learning to be in the struggle. I find the real me.
Before feminism had a name, before feminism became organized, women were already living under systems that sharply limited their autonomy. In much of the Western world, social life was built around the assumption that men belonged to the public sphere and women belonged to the private one. Men held office, controlled property, shaped law, and moved through education and professional life with far fewer restrictions. Women were expected to marry, maintain the home, raise children, and operate within a framework that treated domesticity as destiny.
Some more toast, team. Hey, team, why don't you get cracking on a thorough fall house cleaning campaign around here? Get the floors waxed, get the windows washed, get this place looking as if civilized people are in residence, Gee, that's a little light, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I hurried it.
Sweetie, have a little more damson plum preserves, please.
Even when individual women pushed against those limits, the larger structure remained clear. Public life wasn't really built with them in mind. The earliest roots of feminism grew out of that reality, but they also grew out of broader reform movements. In the United States, abolitionism, moral reform, and political upheaval helped create the atmosphere in which women began asking a dangerous question. If liberty and equity were supposed to mean something, why were women excluded from so much of public life? Women's history identifies reform movements like abolition and temperance as key roots of early feminist organizing. And that exclusion was reinforced from multiple directions at once. It wasn't just law, it was custom, economics, religion, family structure, and the expectation that a respectable woman was supposed to build her life around service, restraint, and dependence. In many cases, even when women worked, that work was treated differently. It was often underpaid, undervalued, or seen as temporary compared to the public authority automatically given to men. So before feminism was a named movement, there was already a lived imbalance built into daily life. Women didn't need a theory to know the difference. They could see it in who spoke for family, who owned property, who entered politics, who received serious education, and who expected to quietly hold everything together behind the scenes. That question mattered because it pushed women from private frustration into public argument. It helped lay the groundwork for a movement that would eventually demand not just respect, but recognition under law. That pressure helped lead to what's usually called first wave feminism. This is the version of feminism most people can picture most easily because its goals were so concrete. It focused heavily on legal identity, civic participation, and suffrage. In the United States, the 1848 Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls became a defining landmark. Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped organize the convention and wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which deliberately echoed the language of the Declaration of Independence, while insisting that women, too, were entitled to equality and political voice. Women's History Museum and Britannica both place first-wave feminism's landmark beginnings around Seneca Falls and define it around legal and political rights. The demand that shocked many people at the time was the demand for voting rights. To later generations, that can sound basic, but back then, it was treated as radical. First wave feminism wasn't just asking for better manners or more respect. It was challenging the legal and political hierarchy itself. That's why this phase of feminism feels so clear in retrospect. Its enemy was visible, its demands were specific, its victories were measurable. Suffrage became the most famous symbol of that fight. But it stood beside wider questions about education, property, civic life, and legal standing. First wave feminism established something bigger than any single reform. It established the idea that women weren't just members of households or dependents under male authority, but political actors in their own right. When people look back on early feminism today, they often do so with a certain clarity, because the injustice is easy to identify from a distance. It's easy to see why women fought for the right to vote. It's easy to understand why legal exclusion produced organized resistance. In hindsight, first-wave feminism can feel almost self-evident. And that clarity gives us an important contrast because as feminism moved forward, its mission became less about one giant denied right and more about the deeper patterns shaping everyday life. That shift became fully visible in second-wave feminism. If the first wave asked whether women could enter public life, the second wave asked what kind of life they were entering. This movement, often associated with the 1960s and 1970s, reached into work, family, sex, education, politics, and the home. It was no longer about access. It was about structure. Britannica describes second-wave feminism as a broader women's movement that reached beyond suffrage into everyday social life. Could women work and advance without being pushed into lower expectations? Could marriage exist without trapping women in unequal dependence? Could women control their own bodies and futures? Could domestic life stop being treated as a natural excuse for limiting public power? The second wave widens the lens. It argued that equality wasn't only about law on paper, but about expectations and institutions that shaped actual life. This is also where feminism became more culturally disruptive. First wave feminism challenged law. Second wave feminism challenged the social order underneath the law. It questioned the idea that traditional gender roles were neutral or inevitable. It pushed into universities, media, the workplace, and family life. That gave it enormous reach, but it also made the movement less tidy. And that's really where the tone of feminism changed. Earlier feminism could point to obvious barriers and say, there, that, fix that. Second wave feminism had to deal with something harder. Systems that could claim women were included while still pressuring them into limited roles. A woman could legally work, but still be expected to carry the overwhelming weight of home and children. A woman could enter public life, but still be treated as less serious, less stable, or less suited for authority. That's what made the second wave so significant. It forced the conversation past legal entry and into lived reality. Once a movement moves from women should be allowed to vote to the organization of family, labor, sex, power, and culture may all be unequal, the number of arguments multiplies. The movement becomes larger, but also harder to contain. Still, second wave feminism was enormously consequential because it changed how equality itself was understood. Equality no longer meant only formal access. It meant asking whether the rules, incentives, and expectations around women were themselves titled. By the time third wave feminism emerged in the 1990s, the movement was no longer dealing with the same world its earlier generations had faced. Many legal rights had already been won, at least formally. That changed the entire atmosphere. The movement now had to ask different questions. Not simply, what rights are denied, but who has been centered in the movement? Whose experiences were ignored? Does empowerment look the same for everyone? And can women define liberation differently? Britannica dates third wave feminism to the 1990s and describes it as emerging in a more media-saturated and culturally diverse environment. Third wave feminism often emphasized individuality, plurality, and critique, especially critique of earlier feminism's blind spots about race, class, sexuality, and culture. This is where the clean edges start to blur. Earlier feminism can be taught in a neat arc: exclusion, organizing, reform, victory. Third wave feminism is much messier because it's partly about internal disagreement. It's feminism arguing with older feminism. It's the movement questioning itself while also confronting the outside world. It's also where media representation, pop culture, fashion, sexuality, and identity become harder to separate from politics. That doesn't make it less important, it makes it more complicated. The movement was no longer just fighting old laws, it was navigating a landscape shaped by consumer culture, celebrity culture, and increasingly public arguments about the female empowerment even meant. Once that happens, feminism starts to feel less like one organized front and more like an umbrella under which many competing visions are trying to live. That complexity only deepened in the modern era. Today, feminism is often described in explicitly intersectional terms. in that framing gender doesn't exist in isolation. It overlaps with race, class, disability, sexuality, and other forms of social inequality. That helps explain why modern feminism often sounds broader than earlier versions. It's no longer only about women as one category moving toward one goal. It's often presented as a lens for understanding overlapping systems of power and disadvantages. UN Women's current explainers explicitly frame contemporary feminism in intersectional terms. For supporters, this makes feminism more complete and more honest. For critics, it can make the movement seem harder to define, less focused, and more likely to drift into theory, branding, or ideological sprawl. Either way, it's a major shift from the other image of feminism as a concentrated campaign for plainly denied rights. Modern feminism also lives in a media environment earlier generations never had to deal with. Social media compresses complicated ideas into slogans. Corporate branding wraps political language into marketing. Internet culture rewards conflict, identity signaling, and constant reaction. That makes feminism more visible than ever, but it also makes it easier to flatten, distort, commercialize, and argue over. The movement is now operating in a world where activism, branding, academia, and pop culture often bleed together. This is where the contrast becomes the whole point. Then, feminism was easier to recognize because the barriers were easier to point at. Women couldn't vote. Women faced obvious legal restrictions. Women were openly steered away from education, office, and professional independence. The fight had visible targets. Now, the argument is very different. In many places, especially in the United States, women's formal legal status has changed dramatically. Women are present in higher education, the workforce, politics, and professional life in ways that would have been almost unimaginable to earlier generations. That doesn't mean every issue is solved. It means the terrain of the movement has changed. Pew reports that women made up 47% of the U.S. civilian labor force in 2023, up from 30% in 1950, and that young women are more likely than young men to hold bachelor's degrees. The question is no longer only whether women can enter institutions, it's what those institutions still reward, punish, overlook, or distort. That's why modern feminism often feels more contested than early feminism. The old mission was concrete. The new mission is interpretive. Earlier generations were often battling visible exclusion. Now the arguments are about systems, representation, norms, incentives, language, status, and competing definitions of fairness. And that difference matters because it changes how people respond to the movement. A concrete fight is easier to rally around. If women are denied the vote, the injustice is visible. If women are denied access to property or education, the problem can be named in a sentence. But once the battle shifts into culture, institutions, identity, expectation, and interpretation, the lines become harder to draw. People start asking different questions. Is this inequality or a difference in outcomes? Is this a real structural barrier or a broader social pattern? Is the movement still focused or has it become too broad to define cleanly? That's part of why the modern version creates more argument. Not necessarily because it matters less, but because it's dealing with problems that are harder to point at and harder to measure in a simple way. One person might see modern feminism as a necessary evolution that finally addresses complexity and long-ignored voices. Another might see it as a movement that lost some clarity after its most obvious victories, becoming vulnerable to corporate branding, online slogan making, ideological infighting, and endless fragmentation. And if we're being honest, both perceptions exist for a reason. A movement that broadens its scope can become more inclusive, but it can also become harder to unify. What got better? What got messier? None of this means feminism failed. Far from it. It means success changed the movement's environment. When a movement wins major legal and cultural ground, it doesn't remain frozen in its original form. It adapts, splinters, expands, and argues over what comes next. Feminism helped reshape law, work, education, and public expectations. But the cost of becoming broader is the world itself now carries more meanings. For some people, feminism still means the straightforward belief that women should be treated as full equals in public and private life. For others, it now refers to a dense framework of social analysis, institutional critique, and identity-based politics. For others, still, it's become a symbol people either embrace or reject based on what they think the movement has turned into. Britannica still defines feminism broadly as the belief in full social, economic, and political equality for women. That may be the real lesson in looking at feminism then versus now. The movement didn't just grow, it changed categories. It moved from demanding entry into public life to re-examining the values, rules, and structures inside that life. It moved from fighting exclusion to fighting interpretation. It moved from a campaign with a few unmistakable targets to a sprawling argument over culture, power, identity, and meaning. That makes the modern version harder to summarize, but it also explains why the word still carries so much force. It points to a history that undeniably changed the world, and to a present that still can't agree on what the next phase should look like. Pew found in 2024 that most Americans said women's gains had not come at the expense of men, which helps show that broad support for women's advancement still exists, even while modern arguments remain heated. So if you want the cleanest way to say it, it's this. Early feminism fought to make women visible in a system that openly limited them. Modern feminism fights over what justice, equality, and representation are supposed to mean inside a world that's already been changed by those earlier victories. That's why feminism then can feel clearer, and feminism now can feel messier. The first was often a battle for entry. The second is a battle over interpretation. And maybe that's why the movement still sparks so much debate. Not because its history is unclear, but because its future is. And, I'm not going to sit here and get political and all this other crap. Look, I was raised primarily by women. Single mom household, 2 aunts. Realistically, the only man that was in my life consistently was my grandfather. And he, I feel like he raised me right. I mean, heck, he had 3 daughters and a wife. That being said, this is not something where I'm over here going to be talking crap about feminism or feminists. I'm not over here choosing sides. I'm not over here trying to split sides either. This is just a very easy video about the history of feminism. It's not that deep, you guys. I'll see you guys in the next one. Much love.